When Zena had gone, Ethan and Maddie stood in silence for a moment. Then Maddie began to tidy the kitchen, and Ethan went outside to check the animals, as he did every night. The room was empty when he returned, but on the table under his pipe was a piece of paper. 3 words were written on it. Ethan, don't worry. There was a small room at the back of the house where Ethan kept his books and papers. His mother had let him use it as a study room when he first returned to the farm after his father's accident. He still sat there in summer, but the room had no fire, and in winter it was too cold. This was where he went to look again at his message from Maddie. It was the first time she had ever written to him. He read her words and felt nearer to her, but at the same time he remembered that very soon he would never see her again. Soon there'll be no warm smile, no gentle voice, only this, cold paper and dead words, he thought. He lay down on a hard little bed that was there, covered himself with an old coat, and began to think about his life. He had lost so many chances and forgotten so many of his dreams, all to please Zena. But she was now far more discontented than when he had married her. Must he live the rest of his days beside this bitter, complaining woman? No. He was too young and strong, too full of life to throw away all hope of happiness. Then he thought, why shouldn't he leave with Maddie the next day? He would hide his suitcase under the seat of the sleigh, leave Zena a letter. He jumped up, lit the lamp again, sat down at the table, and began to write. Zena, I've done everything I could for you, but it hasn't worked. It's neither my fault nor yours. Maybe it'll be better for both of us if we live apart. I'm going to see what I can find in the West. You can sell the farm and sawmill and keep the money. At that word, he stopped writing and began to think. Without the farm, he would have no money. He was sure that he could find work in the West, but would he get enough money to take care of Maddie too? And what about Zena, alone on the farm? She couldn't keep it going on her own, and it would be hard to sell. The land was poor, and not many people would want to buy it. But how could he let poor Maddie leave alone? As he picked up his pen, his eye fell on a Bettsbridge newspaper. He saw the words, Journeys to the West, and pulled the lamp nearer to see the prices of the tickets. Then the pen fell from his hand, and he pushed the unfinished letter away. He didn't even have the money to take Maddie to the West. He had already borrowed to mend the sawmill and couldn't borrow any more. The cold facts closed around him like prison doors. There was no way out, none. He was locked in that prison for life, and now his one light was disappearing. He lay down again with a heavy heart and tears burning in his eyes. Through the window, he saw the snow-covered slopes shining in the moonlight, the silver-edged darkness of the woods, and the shadowy purple of the hills against the sky. He felt that the beauty of the night was laughing at him, lying there so miserably. He fell asleep. In the morning, he woke cold and hungry. He went to the window and saw a red sun coming up over the gray edges of the fields. "This is Matt's last day," he said to himself. He tried to think how the place would be without her. He heard a step behind him, turned round, and saw Mattie. She looked so small and thin, standing there in her poor dress in the cold, wintry light. "I'll come and light the kitchen fire," he said. Mattie started her usual morning housework. The kitchen slowly became warmer, and the first sunlight entered the room. Ethan began to feel more hopeful. Maybe Zena didn't mean what she said, he thought. Maybe, now that daylight's here, she'll think again and let Mattie stay. He went up to Mattie and touched her arm gently. "I don't want you to worry, Matt," he said, looking down into her eyes with a smile. "I guess things'll be all right." "No, I ain't going to worry," she said softly. He went out to the farm, and soon afterwards Jotham Powell joined him. As they were doing their morning's work with the cows, Jotham said, "Mrs. Frome told me the new girl's comin' today, and Mattie's leavin'. I got to take her down to the station." Ethan felt the blood beating in his head. After a moment, he found his voice and said, "Oh, it ain't so sure that Mattie's going." "Is that so?" said Jotham, not at all interested, and he went on with his work. When they returned to the kitchen, the two women were already at breakfast. Zena was eating well and seemed very lively and busy. She looked at the hired man. "Jotham, I want you here mid-afternoon to pick up Mattie," she said. "The new girl's getting to the station at 5 o'clock. Mattie can get the train at 6. Then she turned to Mattie and went on. "Now, what have you done with one of my best cotton sheets? And there are a few other things missing, too." Mattie followed Zena out of the room, leaving the two men alone. "I guess I'll come round mid-afternoon then," said Jotham to his employer. When the morning's work was finished, Ethan said to Jotham, "I'm going down to Starkfield. Tell them not to wait for me at dinner time." It was a clear, still morning, with a whisper of spring in the air. The snowy fields shone silver in the bright morning sunlight. Ethan walked down the road, angry and ashamed. So Mattie really was leaving, and he could only stand by, helpless. What must she think of him? As he walked, he could feel laughing voice in the song of the birds. He knew that he had to do something. But what? Then a thought came to him. Andrew Hale was a kind-hearted man. Maybe, thought Ethan, he'll let me have some money now, If I tell him that Zena's really sick and that we need a hired girl to help her, Mrs. Hale will listen to me, I'm sure." He thought about this idea as he walked faster and faster down the road. With each long step, he felt more sure of his plan's success. And with $50 in his pocket, nothing could keep him from Mattie. As he came into Starkfield, he saw the Hales' sleigh and hurried forward to meet it. The sleigh stopped, and Mrs. Hale's round, motherly face looked out. She smiled at Ethan, told him that her husband was at home, then added, "I'm sorry that Zena's feeling bad again. She's lucky to have you to take care of her. And so was your poor mother. You've had an awful hard life, Ethan Frome." When she had gone, Ethan felt less alone in his unhappiness. It had been a long time since anyone had spoken to him as kindly as Mrs. Hale. The Hales were caring people who felt sorry for him, and now he felt sure that they would help him. He started down the road to their house, then stopped after a few steps. He suddenly saw himself and his life in the clear light of day. He was a poor man, planning to leave his sickly wife all alone and without money. And how was he planning to do this heartless thing? By telling lies to two kind people who felt sorry for him. He turned and walked slowly back to the farm. Chapter 7. The Last Ride. It was about midday when Ethan got home. Zena was by the fire, with a scarf on her head and a book about stomach pains in her hand. She did not move or look up. "Where's Mattie?" Ethan asked. Zena continued to read her book. "I guess she's packing her case," she replied. Ethan went straight upstairs. Mattie's door was closed. "Matt," he said in a low voice. There was no answer, so he gently pushed open the door. Mattie was sitting on her case in her best dress, with her back to the door and her face in her hands. She was crying. Ethan put his hands on her shoulders. "Matt, oh, don't. Oh, Matt." "Ethan, I thought you weren't coming back," she cried, lifting her wet face to his. He took her in his arms and kissed her soft hair. Then they heard Zena calling and moved away from each other. He carried her suitcase downstairs, and with every tick of the clock, the pain in his heart grew. At dinner, he could eat nothing. After the meal, Zena sat down by the fire, and Mattie began to wash the dishes. Jotham got up from the table and asked Ethan, "So what time will I come round for Mattie?" "You needn't come round. I'm going to drive her over myself," he answered. Zena lifted her head. "I want you here this afternoon, Ethan. You'll have to get the room ready for the new girl. Jotham can take Mattie." I'm going to drive her over myself, he repeated in a hard voice. He turned to Matty. You be ready at 3, Matt. I've got business in Corbury. With those words, he left the house. He could feel the hot blood beating in his head as the anger burned inside him. He hurried through his work, then went to get the horse and sleigh. He remembered the day when he had got the sleigh ready in order to fetch his wife's cousin from the station. It was little more than a year ago, on a soft afternoon just like this, with a whisper of spring in the air. And all the days between then and now came back to him, one by one. He jumped into the sleigh and drove up to the house. The kitchen was empty, and Matty's case and coat lay ready by the door. After a moment, he heard someone moving about in his study room. He pushed open the door and saw Matty standing by the table. "What are you doing in there, Matt?" "Just looking around," she replied. "Where's Zena?" "Gone upstairs. She said she had her pains again." "Didn't she say goodbye?" "No, that was all she said." They went back into the kitchen. Ethan looked slowly around the room, thinking, "In a few hours, I shall return here alone. I'm looking at Matty here for the last time." He could not believe it. It all seemed so unreal. "Come on," he said, opening the door. He helped her into the sleigh, and with a "go along" to the horse, they started off down the hill. "We got lots of time for a good ride, Matt," he said, taking her hand in his. As they left the farm, he did not take the road toward Starkfield, but turned the horse to the right, up the Bettsbridge road. Matty did not seem surprised. "Are you going round by Shadow Pond?" "You knew, didn't you?" he laughed. The road took them down into a wood, where the trees shone reddish in the afternoon sun, leaving soft blue shadows on the untouched snow. There was a warm stillness in the wood. In the middle was a small icy pond, with sweet-smelling trees all around. It was a quiet, secret place, like the quiet sadness in Ethan's heart. They saw a fallen tree by the icy water, half covered in snow. It was where they had sat once last August, together with a group of young people from Starkfield Church. They sat down now in the same place, and remembered those few happy moments from that hot summer afternoon. Ethan looked at Matty's hair and wished he could touch it again. He wanted to tell her that it smelled of the woods in springtime, but he had never learned to say things like that. When the sun began to go down behind the hill, Matty said, "We mustn't stay here any longer." As they drove back toward Starkfield, the sky was turning gray, with a cold red over the western hills. "Matt," Ethan said at last, "what'll you do? Can't you ask your father's family for help?" "I don't want to ask them," she replied. Then, after a moment, added, I guess I'll find something. You know I'd do anything for you. Yes, I know. But I can't. She was silent, but he felt her shoulder shaking. Oh, Matt, he cried. I wish. She turned to him. Ethan, I found this. She held out a piece of paper. It was the unfinished letter to his wife, which he had forgotten to destroy. A painful happiness ran through him. Were Maddie's dreams the same as his? He had to know. Do you feel like that too, Matt? Tell me, Matt. Tell me. Oh, Ethan, what does it matter now? She cried. With a sudden movement, she tore the letter into pieces and threw them onto the snow. For a moment, she was silent, then said in a low voice, The first time I thought of you like that was at Shadow Pond. Then I often used to think about you on summer nights when the moon was too bright and I couldn't sleep. Her words filled Ethan's heart with sweetness. Darkness began to fall, and they drove on in silence for a while. I'm fastened hand and foot, Matt. There isn't a thing I can do, he began again. You must write to me sometimes, Ethan. Oh, what can writing do? I want to put my hand out and touch you. I want to take care of you. I want to be there when you're sick and when you're lonely. Oh, Ethan, I wish I was dead, she cried. Don't let's talk that way, he whispered. As they arrived in Starkfield, a sleigh with bells passed them. They heard happy children's voices and saw a group of village boys with sleds. They drove on to the top of the Corbury Road. On one side was the tall white shape of the church, on the other were the dark shadows of the Varnum trees. The steep slope lay empty and white below them. An idea came to Ethan to help himself and her through their miserable last hour. He turned to Maddie. We never went coasting last night. Shall we go down now? How would you like that? There isn't time. There's as much time as we want, he said. The hired girl can wait. Look, someone's left a sled under the trees. He helped her out of the sleigh and took her by the hand towards the sled. They both sat down on it, with Maddie in front and Ethan behind. It's so dark, Ethan. Are you sure you can see? Oh, I can do this with my eyes closed, he laughed. She laughed with him. Then, after a moment, he cried, Now! They started off, and soon the sled was flying down the slope, round the corner by the big tree, and down the second slope. They came to a stop, picked up the sled, and began to climb up the hill again. It was wonderful, laughed Maddie. Weren't you afraid when we went round the tree? I'm never afraid with you, she replied. A deep silence seemed to fall from the starless sky. At each step of their climb, Ethan said to himself, It's the last time we'll ever walk together. When they reached the Varnum trees, Ethan put back the sled. "I guess this must be Ned Hale's sled," he said. "Is this where Ned and Ruth kissed each other?" Mattie whispered, throwing her arms round Ethan. Her lips found his, and Ethan held her close to him. "Goodbye, goodbye," she said in a shaking voice, and kissed him again. "Matt, I can't let you go. What'll we do? What'll we do?" They stood holding hands like children. Through the stillness, they heard the church clock. "Oh, Ethan, it's already 5 o'clock. It's time." "Time for what? I'm not leaving you now. How can we go anywhere without each other after this?" Suddenly she threw her arms round his neck again. "Ethan, Ethan, I want you to take me down again." "Down where?" "Down there, into the tree, to finish it all. Then we'll never have to leave each other again." "Matt, what are you saying? Are you crazy?" "No, but I will be crazy if I leave you. Where'll I go without you? You're the only person who's ever been good to me. And there'll be a strange girl sleeping in my bed where I used to lie at night and think of you." Her words were like pieces torn from his heart. Now at last he knew that Mattie's feelings were as strong as his. How could he go back to that hated house, to the woman who was waiting for him there? He held her close and kissed her. But when her face touched his, it was cold and wet with tears. He saw the road down to the station, and through the still air he heard a train. The dark trees covered them in blackness and silence, like a grave. "Perhaps it'll be like this," he thought. "After this, I won't feel anything." "Come," she whispered, pulling at his hand. He picked the sled up, and they took their places on it. This time, he made her sit behind him. She put her arms round him, and he turned his head and kissed her. She was right. This was better than being apart. Just as they started, he heard his horse whinny. First came the steep drop, and they seemed to be flying through the air, high up into the cloudy night. Then Ethan saw the big tree at the corner of the road, and he said between his teeth, "We can do it. I know we can do it." As they flew towards the tree, Mattie held him closer, and he seemed to feel her heart beating. The tree became bigger and nearer. "It's waiting for us. It knows," he thought. But suddenly, his wife's face, grim and twisted, appeared before him, and he moved to push the picture away. There was a last moment when the air shot past him like millions of burning stars. And then, the tree. The sky was still cloudy, but when he looked straight up, he saw a single star. What was its name? Used to know, but he couldn't remember. He felt so tired. Through the deep stillness, he heard a little animal making a small, frightened sound. He knew the animal was in terrible pain. He could feel its pain shooting through his own body. He reached out his left arm to help the poor animal and felt something soft under his hand. He tried to move but could not because there was a rock or some heavy thing lying on him. Then he realized that his hand was on Maddie's face, and the sound was coming from her lips. He put his face next to hers, and in the darkness he saw her eyes open and heard her say his name. "Oh, Matt, I thought we'd done it," he whispered. And far away, up the hill, he heard the horse whinny, and thought, "I ought to give him his supper."